So I've just finished my second year medicine exams at Cambridge. Is it as hard as people think? How much free time did I have? How does it compare with other degrees? Well, I'm going to show you what I did in my second year and give you a glimpse into my uni experience. Let's go back to the start. Term 1, or as we say in Cambridge, Michaelmas term. See, year 2 is seen as a bit of a step up from year 1, and I definitely felt this from the get-go. Instead of studying 3 hardcore subjects in year 1, we study 4 instead in year 2. These are BOD, NHB, MODA, and HNA, which are pathology, neurobiology and human behaviour, pharmacology, and head and neck anatomy. Unlike first year, all of our teaching was in person, but our lectures were recorded online, which meant that we didn't have to wake up for every 9 AM. But I found it generally helped to keep me in a good routine. A big change that I found in second year was that teaching anatomy went from dissection to prosection. But after doing head and neck anatomy, I can sort of see why. The structures in the head and neck are so complex that I feel it would be hard for medical students to dissect it accurately and to see everything that they would need to see to learn it properly. Just going through each of our modules, in HNA or head and neck anatomy, we went through, well, head and neck anatomy. There's not much more I can say about that, apart from I actually found it quite interesting. And it's sort of built on the principles that we learned in first year in Fab. In NHB, in first term, we spent time looking at how we detect changes in our environment. So that was looking at things like the visual system, the auditory system, the somatosensory system, and the olfactory system. I know some people really enjoyed it, but we used to have NHB lectures on a Monday morning at 9 AM, which is why I didn't particularly enjoy it. In BOD or pathology, we spent most of first term looking at how our body fights diseases. Pathology is basically the study of disease, which I found super interesting, but super difficult because there were so many small details in the course. And in MODA or pharmacology, we spent most of our first term looking at different drugs affecting the cardiovascular system and the peripheral nervous system. Drugs you may have heard about which we'd studied include beta blockers, ACE inhibitors, and local anesthetics, such as lidocaine. In first term, I worked super hard, up to a point about 3/4 of the way through where I sort of sat and asked myself, why am I working so hard? To which I didn't really have a proper answer. Exams were months away, and I was working for the sake of working. I think if I were to go back and give myself some advice for first term, it would definitely be to pace myself a bit better. If I had worked hard during the 8 weeks of term rather than super hard for the first 6 weeks, I probably would have been in a better position when coming up to exams. To help others get into Cambridge, me and my friend Faraz made a BMAT course on sigmamed.co.uk. It covers everything you need fairly comprehensively, including the strategies that we use to get top marks in the BMAT, content for section 2, and essay examples for section 3. We found some of the third-party resources were lacking, and the assumed knowledge guide can sometimes be a bit much to trawl through. Hence why we made the course to kind of condense everything down and get all the high yield stuff all in one place. Term 2, or as we call it in Cambridge, Lent term. Lent is known as the killer term. It's a term which everyone who's done Cambridge Med thinks is probably the hardest of them all. If I show you my timetable for a few weeks this Lent, this is what it looks like, which has everything included in it. And got to a point where I began timetabling in my meals and free time, because if I didn't, I probably wouldn't get around to it. Like last term, we carried on with neuro, pharmacology and pathology, but did no more head and neck anatomy and began human reproduction, or HR. In human reproduction, we learn about the science of human reproduction. So that's everything from production of the gamete, to fertilization, to embryogenesis, to the embryo becoming a fetus. In NHB or neuro, we move away from sensory pathways and begin looking at motor pathways, so that's looking at movement. And we also begin to look at the psychology of medicine, which I actually found quite interesting. But I know others found it pretty boring. I found it quite interesting because it was something that a lot of my non-medic friends also found interesting. And so we could talk about it and talk about how medicine deals with it and how their subjects would deal with it. In BOD or pathology, we began looking at cancer, parasites, and bacteria, which again I found really interesting, but I didn't really have the time to look at it in the depth that I wanted to. In MODA or pharmacology, we began looking at probably one of the most clinically relevant parts of the course, which included stuff such as antibiotics, anti-cancer drugs, and steroids. Now, in Lent term, I didn't really fully commit to my studies, but at the same time, I didn't commit to having an amazing social life at the same time, so I was sort of stuck in the middle. It's easy to say now that I should have worked harder, but in the moment, I'm not sure how much harder I could have worked sustainably before it no longer became healthy. We finished off the term with an exam for head and neck anatomy, which comes at a sort of inconvenient time, but looking back, I can't think of a more convenient time to put it. It would always be an inconvenience because the year is just so packed. Term 3, Easter term. After doing as much work as I could in the 6 weeks break between Lent and Easter, I knew that Easter would be one last big push before our long 3.5 month summer break. So I knew it was either I could do the work right now in Easter, or I'd end up doing it in summer for resits in September, which no one wants to do. Now, bod or pathology was finished off in Lent term, which meant that we had no lectures in the first 2 or 3 weeks for bod in Easter. But we did have lectures for NHB, MODA and HR during our first 2 or 3 weeks of Easter term. In NHB, we learned more about the psychology of medicine. In MODA, we learned about neuropharmacology, so that included drugs such as morphine and diazepam. And in human reproduction, we learned a little bit about STIs and gene imprinting. Like first year, I really struggled to learn the content from these 3 weeks of lectures during Easter. I was so bogged down with content that I hadn't learned from Michaelmas and Lent that I just didn't get the time to even look through some of the lectures. And so I ended up going to exams having not even looked at the lectures nor the lecture slides, which is an absolute worst case scenario. In general, second year had a lot more work than first year, and if I were to give one piece of advice to any first years moving into second year, it would be to work consistently throughout the year. The course in second year is designed in such a way that you need to understand it as you're going along, because if you don't understand whilst you're going along, then it just won't make any sense towards the end. And if you do understand, then it gels up really nicely and you get this really nice conceptual map of the human body in your mind. This makes it easier when answering exam questions because you can conceptually understand what happens when a patient takes a certain drug or they have certain side effects or whatever the question wants to ask. In first year, you probably could save your exams right at the end if you'd done very minimal work throughout the year. Whereas in second year, you sort of have to do work throughout the year so that by the end, it all gels together and you'll do really, really well if you do work throughout the year. Thank you for sticking around to the end. If you enjoyed watching, then please let me know and I'll see you next time.